No one wakes up imagining that it will be their last day of freedom for many years. To him, it was just another ordinary morning. The alarm went off at the usual time. Coffee was prepared without haste. The routine remained intact, as if nothing were about to change. He left home believing he would return at the end of the day as he always did. But life rarely warns you when everything is about to change. The crime had happened the night before. A serious case that quickly gained attention. The city was talking. The authorities felt the pressure. It wasn't just about finding the person responsible. It was about providing a quick response, showing control, showing efficiency. And in this type of scenario, haste is often the enemy of truth. He was approached without understanding the exact reason. Direct questions, suspicious glances, a tone that didn't match someone who had never had trouble with the police. Still, he cooperated. He believed everything would be cleared up quickly. After all, he hadn't done anything wrong. But at that moment, logic no longer mattered much. One detail matched the vague description of the suspect. A similar piece of clothing, an approximate time, a place that was too close. Small coincidences that together began to build a dangerous narrative. He noticed the shift when he stopped being treated as someone who was helping and started being treated as someone who needed to explain himself. Hours later, he was informed that a witness claimed to recognize him. The identification was quick, poorly conducted, without clear criteria. Still, it was accepted as sufficient. There was no proper cross-examination, no caution. The mistake was already in motion. When they announced his arrest, he fell silent. Not because he was guilty, but because he was trying to understand how reality could distort so fast. As he was being led away, he thought it wouldn't last, that someone would review the facts, that the truth would appear naturally. It was just a misunderstanding, a simple mistake, something that would be corrected as soon as the details were analyzed calmly. The problem is that when a version becomes convenient, it is usually defended with force. That night he didn't return home, and without knowing it, he had begun a long road, marked by years of waiting, silence, and injustice. The next day he woke up in a place he didn't recognize as real. The cold walls, the strange smell, the constant noise of doors closing. Everything seemed temporary. He kept repeating to himself that it would be resolved soon. It was enough for someone to listen carefully. It was enough to look at the facts calmly. But calm didn't exist in that system. During the interrogation, he answered the same questions several times. Only the order and the tone changed. When his answers didn't fit the version that had already been created, impatience arose. They weren't seeking to understand, they were seeking to confirm. Every word said seemed to be used not to clarify, but to reinforce a suspicion that was already formed. They said a witness had seen him at the scene of the crime. He explained where he was. He cited times. He mentioned people. None of this information was investigated with the necessary care. It was simpler to accept the identification than to admit it could be wrong. Human error, when institutionalized, gains strength. His lawyer tried to question the procedure. He pointed out flaws in the identification. He asked for new analyses, but everything seemed to run at its own pace, indifferent to logic. The process moved forward as if on autopilot. In the documents, he was no longer a person. He was a name associated with a number, a case to be closed, a problem to be solved quickly. Pre-trial detention was ordered. They said it was a precautionary measure, that it was temporary, that everything would soon be cleared up. But time inside did not work like it did outside. The days began to drag. He was transferred to a cell shared with strangers, people with hard stories, marked gazes, heavy silences. There, the presumption of innocence did not exist. He began to understand that proving he didn't commit a crime was much harder than accusing him. Letters from family arrived full of hope. This will be resolved. We are confident. He tried to respond with the same optimism even when doubt began to seep in. Not about his innocence, but about the system. The trial was set, and at that moment he still believed that would be the day everything would make sense. That someone would listen, that someone would realize the error. He didn't know he was about to face something even more cruel, the final transformation of a fragile suspicion into an official truth. The courtroom was full, but he felt completely alone. Sitting there, wearing simple borrowed clothes, he watched unknown faces decide his future. The judge, the prosecutors, the jurors. They all seemed too distant to see him as a human being. He was no longer a man. He was the defendant. The prosecution presented its version firmly. They spoke of times, of coincidences, of an identification made under pressure. Every detail was narrated with conviction, as if there were no doubt. The word allegedly was being replaced by increasingly direct statements. When the witness took the stand, his heart raced. She pointed in his direction with hesitation. She said she believed it was him, that it looked a lot like him, that she wasn't absolutely sure, but thought so. That was enough. The defense tried to react. They explained how identifications can fail. They cited studies. They pointed out contradictions. They showed there was no physical, digital, or genetic evidence, only a fragile memory built under stress. But doubt there did not work in his favor. The jurors seemed more attentive to safety than to the truth. Collective fear weighed more than logic. It was more comfortable to convict someone than to run the risk of acquitting and being wrong. When it was his turn to speak, he stood up with trembling hands. He looked around and said the only thing he had. "I didn't do this." He spoke of his routine, of his family, of who he was before all that. He didn't ask for mercy. He asked for justice. He asked them to look beyond the process, beyond the paper. But words do not compete with ready-made narratives. The verdict came after a few hours. Guilty. The sentence was read as if it were just another number in a statistic. Years in prison. Stolen years. Years that no one could give back. He felt his legs fail. The sound of the room disappeared. The world seemed to shrink until it fit inside his own chest. There were no screams. No reaction. Only silence. In that instant, he understood something devastating. Justice didn't need to be right to be final. While being led away in handcuffs, a thought echoed in his mind, repeatedly. If the truth wasn't enough here, how long would it take to appear? Prison wasn't just a closed place. It was a world apart, governed by rules no one explained clearly, but everyone learned too fast. On the first day, he realized that time inside didn't pass, it accumulated. Every morning began the same. A metallic noise, doors opening, counts, silences that were too long. The clock on the wall seemed to mock him, moving slowly while life outside went on without him. In the first few months, he still talked a lot. He explained his story to anyone who would listen. He repeated that he was innocent. Some believed him. Others only listened out of politeness. Many smiled with skepticism. Almost everyone said the same thing. In here, everyone is innocent. Over time, he learned to speak less. Prison didn't just punish the body, it punished the identity. He ceased to be who he was before. He stopped being known by his full name. He became a number, a nickname, an improvised role. Visits were rare and painful. The family tried to keep hope alive, but the wear and tear was visible. His mother's gaze aged with every meeting. His father spoke less. Friends began to disappear, not out of malice, but out of an inability to deal with that reality. Outside, life continued. Weddings happened, children were born, the world changed. Inside the prison, he remained frozen on the day of his sentencing. At night, lying on a hard bed, he relived the trial countless times. He thought about what he could have said differently, how an insignificant detail had been interpreted in the worst possible way, how a small mistake turned into a massive conviction. There were days when hope felt like a weight. Faith wavered, not in the truth, but in the possibility that someone was still willing to look for it. Even so, he decided not to lose himself completely. He began to read everything he could find. He learned about laws, processes, appeals. He wrote long letters to public defenders, organizations, journalists. Most were not answered. Some came back. Others simply disappeared. But he continued, because giving up meant accepting guilt that wasn't his, and even surrounded by high walls, bars, and concrete. An idea persisted in his mind. If the truth still existed somewhere, it needed to be found. He didn't know when. He didn't know how. But he knew that if he stopped believing, those years wouldn't just be stolen. They would be erased. The years passed without ceremony, one after the other, too much alike to be remembered individually. He no longer counted time in days, but in small changes. Gray hair appearing in the cracked mirror, increasingly short letters from family, the feeling that his old life belonged to someone else. It was on one of those ordinary days that something different happened. A new defender took over some old cases. Forgotten cases. Shelved. Those that no one wanted to touch anymore. When he took his case, he expected nothing beyond the standard. Fragile identification, absence of physical evidence, quick sentencing. But one detail caught his attention. In the original crime report, there was a piece of information almost ignored. The exact time of the incident. Something that, at the time, seemed irrelevant. The defender crossed this data with public records that didn't exist or weren't accessible years ago. Cameras. At the time of the crime, few people trusted these records. Today they were common. The defender decided to check something simple. If there was any active camera nearby that day, there was. The images were archived, forgotten in an old system. They weren't clear. They didn't show faces perfectly, but they showed something important. The true perpetrator had a physical characteristic that he did not possess. Furthermore, the timing of the images contradicted the witness. The defender didn't celebrate. He knew that wasn't enough. The system doesn't move easily, especially when it needs to admit a mistake. Even so, he filed a request for a criminal review. The response took months. Meanwhile, he remained imprisoned, not knowing that for the first time in years, someone was truly looking at his case with genuine attention, without haste, without interest in closing numbers. When he was called to talk to the defender, he heard something he almost didn't recognize. There is a real chance of proving your innocence. He fell silent, not for lack of words, but for an excess of fear. Hope, after so long, was not something simple. It came accompanied by distrust, by memories of broken promises. The defender explained every step. He spoke about forensics, new analyses, hearings. Nothing was guaranteed. Nothing would be fast. But something had changed. For the first time since the day of his arrest, the process was not moving against him. It was moving in favor of the truth. And in that instant, even still behind bars, he felt something he had almost forgotten. The real possibility of breathing outside of there. The reaction was not immediate, but it was predictable. As soon as the request for criminal review entered the system, the gears began to move, not to correct the error but to protect it. Recognizing an unjust conviction meant admitting serious flaws. Superficial investigation, rushed trial, excessive reliance on a single identification. Errors like this don't just affect one case. They affect the credibility of the entire system. And the system doesn't like to admit guilt. The public prosecutor's office took a stand against it. They argued that the witness identification had been sufficient, that the new images were not conclusive, that reopening the case could set a dangerous precedent. Dangerous for whom? The defense insisted. They requested new forensic exams. They requested more detailed technical analysis of the images. They asked for a reassessment of the witness's testimony, now confronted with objective data. The witness no longer showed certainty. Time had weakened that memory which years earlier supported an entire conviction. She admitted she was nervous on the day of the identification, that she had been influenced by comments, that she wasn't absolutely sure. That which was previously treated as indisputable truth began to fall apart. Even so, the process moved slowly. Every petition seemed to face invisible resistance. Documents took a long time to be analyzed. Hearings were postponed. Time, once again, became an instrument of punishment. Inside the prison, he felt this delay as a physical weight. With every expectation created, the fear of frustration arose. The fear that all of this was just another failed attempt. Still, he participated in everything. He recalled details. He redid old routines to prove times. He turned over painful memories in search of something that could help. Meanwhile, the family began to be heard again. People who hadn't been called before. Records that had never been requested. The case finally stopped being simple. But simplicity was never an ally of rushed justice. The judge responsible for the review requested a more complete report. He requested independent technical opinions. For the first time, someone inside the system seemed willing to look beyond the original sentence. It wasn't an acquittal. It wasn't a guarantee. But it was something extremely rare. An opening. And for someone who spent years behind bars for a crime he didn't commit, an opening could mean everything. Doubt had always been present in that process. The difference is that for years, it weighed only against him. Now slowly, it began to change sides. The new technical reports were completed with caution. Independent experts analyzed the old images frame by frame. They adjusted contrast, compared body proportions, approximate height, posture, way of walking. None of these analyses in isolation would be enough to free him. But together, they formed something powerful, a pattern incompatible with him. The man seen in the images was taller. He had another physical structure. A detail on the right shoulder indicated an old injury, something he never had. Small elements that, ignored in the past, now gained relevance. The report was clear. There was a strong possibility of error in the original conviction. When the document reached the judge's hands, the case stopped being just a technical review. It became a serious legal problem. Maintaining the conviction would mean ignoring objective evidence. Reviewing the sentence would mean admitting an innocent man spent years imprisoned. Pressure began to arise. Behind the scenes, the case began to be talked about. Defenders, prosecutors, and magistrates knew that decision could have repercussions. It wasn't just about one man in prison. It was about public trust, institutional responsibility, and human flaws. The family was called to testify again. This time, not as supporting characters, but as an essential part of the process. People who confirmed times, movements, habits. Simple information that had never been listened to with attention. He followed everything from a distance, trying to control his anxiety. Every step forward brought hope, but also fear, because the closer to the truth, the greater the risk of it being ignored again. When he was taken to the decisive hearing, he noticed something different in the environment. There was no haste. There were no absolute certainties. For the first time, everyone there seemed aware of the weight of that decision. The prosecution no longer spoke with the same conviction. Words were measured, sentences, cautious. The discourse had changed. The question was no longer, is he guilty? But rather, what if he never was? And this question, when it is finally asked inside a courtroom, has enough strength to shake any sentence. While the court evaluated the new evidence, something unexpected happened outside. An old, almost forgotten detail came back to light, not through the initiative of justice, but by chance. An ex-inmate recognized the case, upon seeing a short report in a local newspaper. Not the name of the convicted man, but the description of the crime, the place, the time, the way everything had happened. That sparked an uncomfortable memory. He remembered someone. At the time of the crime, he shared a cell with a man who bragged about having escaped from something serious. He had never said names. He had never given full details. But now the coincidence seemed too big. After days of hesitation, he sought out a lawyer. Not out of heroism, but out of conscience. He said he had no physical proof, only a memory. Even so, the information was recorded. The name cited did not appear in the original records. It was someone with a similar criminal record who lived near the crime scene and who had been interrogated superficially at the start of the investigation and released. At the time, he didn't fit the convenient narrative. Now everything began to align. The police were forced to reopen lines of investigation. Old records were unarchived. Addresses, movements, and backgrounds began to be analyzed with real attention, something that hadn't happened before. The man mentioned had disappeared from the city shortly after the crime, another detail ignored in the past. When the name reached the official process, the mood changed for good. It was no longer just about technical doubt. There was the concrete possibility of another perpetrator, and that changed everything. The defense immediately requested the reassessment of the conviction based on a judicial error, a heavy term, a term the system avoids admitting. Inside the prison, he received the news with caution. He didn't celebrate. He didn't build expectations. Years of frustration had taught him that too much hope also hurts. But something was different. For the first time, they weren't just trying to prove he wasn't guilty. They were starting to understand who might be. And when the focus shifts, the truth usually appears. Justice, which for years walked slowly, now seemed to run against time. Because keeping an innocent man imprisoned, knowing there are clear indications of it, stops being a mistake and starts being a choice. And the next hearing wouldn't just define his future. It would define the courage of a system to admit it failed. The decisive hearing was set for a silent morning. There was no fanfare. There weren't excessive cameras. Only a court aware of the confrontation that was about to occur. The request was clear: annulment of the conviction. The reason, devastating. Serious flaws in the original investigation, new witnesses, inconsistencies in the evidence, and the concrete possibility that another man had committed the crime. The prosecution tried to resist. They argued the case was old, that memories fail, that reviews could open dangerous precedents. They spoke of legal certainty and system stability, but none of these words answered the central question: what if he is innocent? The defense reconstructed the entire timeline. They showed how evidence was interpreted in a biased way, how contradictory testimonies were ignored, how the haste for a solution created a fragile truth, supported more by convenience than by facts. Every point presented seemed to strip away a layer of certainty. The judge listened in silence. During the hearing, he was authorized to speak. Something rare, something symbolic. He didn't make a long speech. He didn't attack anyone. He didn't ask for revenge. He just said he lost years that don't come back, dates that don't repeat, people who passed away while he was in prison for something he didn't do. He said he didn't want to destroy the system. He just wanted it to work. The silence that followed was heavy. When the judge announced he needed time to decide, no one was surprised. Decisions like that are not simple. Admitting a mistake of that size doesn't just affect one man. It affects institutions, careers, entire narratives. But too much time had already been taken. Days later, the court met again. This time the atmosphere was different. Less resistance, more responsibility. The decision was read, cold, formal. But the impact was anything but cold. The conviction was annulled. The court recognized that the process had been compromised from the beginning, that the investigation failed, that reasonable doubt always existed, and was ignored. He didn't fall to the floor. He didn't cry immediately. He just closed his eyes. Because at that instant, the weight of years began to leave his shoulders. But freedom hadn't fully arrived. There was still the last step, and that would change everything. The release didn't happen with applause. There was no speech. There was no public apology. The judicial decision was carried out in a simple, almost mechanical way. A document signed, an order issued, an administrative routine that for the system was just another procedure. For him, it was the end of a wait that lasted too many years. When the door opened, he hesitated for a second. Not for fear of freedom, but because everything inside had shaped who he became. The world outside had moved on without him. People aged, places changed, technologies emerged, important dates passed without his presence. As he walked through that gate, he felt something hard to explain. Relief and emptiness at the same time. He was free. But not whole. The family was waiting for him. Tight hugs, tears held back for years, emotions mixed with a silent question that no one dared to ask: how to recover what was lost. There was no answer. In the following days came the shock of reality. Expired documents, interrupted resume, curious looks. Some people believed in his innocence. Others only knew that he had been in prison. Few knew the complete truth. The system offered no support. There was no immediate psychological support. There was no quick reparation. Innocence recognized on paper did not erase the social stigma. He had to relearn how to live. Simple things, crossing a street, choosing what to eat, deciding his own routine, required effort. Time, which was once counted in identical days, now seemed too fast. At night the silence was different. There were no bars. There were no surveillance steps. But there were memories. Many. Even so, he moved on. He didn't seek revenge. He didn't want to destroy anyone. He understood that the error didn't come from a single person, but from a system that failed through haste, carelessness, and overconfidence. The real crime wasn't just the wrong accusation. It was the inability to listen to the doubt. Years later, his case began to be cited in legal studies. Not as a curiosity, but as a warning. An example of what happens when the truth is sacrificed in the name of a quick fix. He never recovered the time lost. But he recovered something essential, the right to exist without guilt. And this story leaves a hard but necessary lesson. Justice doesn't just fail when it convicts an innocent person. It fails when it takes too long to admit the mistake. Because when the truth arrives late, it arrives. But it leaves scars. Some stories don't end when the sentence is annulled. They continue living inside those who hear them. This wasn't just the story of a man imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit. It was the story of stolen time, of the silence that no one wanted to hear, of an error that cost years of an entire life. Throughout this path, we saw how an ignored doubt can turn into a conviction, how haste can dress itself as justice, and how the truth, even when it appears, almost always arrives late. He left prison free on paper. But no one gave back the lost birthdays. No one gave back the hugs that didn't happen.
No one gave back the years left behind. And perhaps that is the hardest part of all. Recognized innocence does not erase the marks left by the error. This story is not rare. It repeats itself, in different places with different names. That is why it needs to be told. If this video made you reflect, like it now, that helps YouTube take this story to more people.
Share it with someone who needs to remember that justice is not haste, it is responsibility. And subscribe to the channel, because here you find real, deep, and impactful stories. Stories that are not made just to be watched, but to be felt. See you in the next video. Until then, don't ignore the silence. Sometimes it's in it that the truth tries to survive.